You're driving down an empty road at night, headlights catching nothing but trees. And then a sign pops up that says, Hitchhikers may be escaping inmates. Not exactly the warm small town welcome, but you don't think too much of it. Instead, you keep going. And then a few miles ahead, you find another that says, do you know where the bears are? At that point, you realize that you may just be in danger. This is the disturbing signs iceberg. Let's begin. Tier 1. Hitchhikers may be escaping inmates. In most places, a hitchhiker is just someone looking for a ride. In Oklahoma, the state felt the need to put up signs reminding you that said hitchhiker might also be running from prison. The official wording on the sign reads, Hitchhikers may be escaping inmates, which really saves you the trouble of wondering why that man in an orange jumpsuit wants to lift to Tulsa. The sign sits near the W.S. Key Correctional Center and Jess Dunn Prison, both of which are on the edge of Taft. A town so small, prisons practically count as the local skyline. Escapes happen often enough that nobody's shocked anymore. Around here, it might be a little hard to tell who's on break and who's on the run. At one point, the state tried to reassure everyone by making it a law that Taft would get a permanent highway patrol post. For a short while, they actually had one. Then it closed, officially because they were short on money and manpower. Now, the sheriff's office tries to pick up the slack with extra patrols, but they can't cover everything, which means when someone walks off prison property, the residents usually find out before the police do. And this isn't only an Oklahoma problem. In Kentucky, Alan Lewis, a prisoner who was being transported to face charges in a different county, tricked a transport officer into loosening his cuffs and then bolted straight to the highway, flagging down cars like he was late for work. In Ohio, another escaped inmate named Joseph Mitchell climbed a fence, cut his hand open, and stumbled to a truck stop where he introduced himself under a fake name and asked truckers for a lift. These sound like plot lines that got pitched to Key and Peele, but they're actually just routine police reports. If you think this one's bad, wait till you see the one where a hospital flat out admits its doctors are infected. That's in Tier 5. Boiling Pond. Tourist towns usually sugarcoat their danger signs. You'll see things like stay on the path or caution, hot surface. But in Beppu, Japan, they skip the politeness entirely. At Chinoike Jigoku, better known as the Bloody Hell Pond, the sign just says danger. If you fall in the pond, you will be boiled. And that's not some dramatic translation. It's literal. The water here hits around 172 degrees Fahrenheit, or 77 degrees Celsius, which is hot enough to peel your skin off. Beppu sells itself as a hot spring resort town. You can sit in sand baths, soak in mineral pools, and even buy red clay skincare made from this very pond. But walk up to the edge of Chinoike, and you'll realize this one isn't for relaxing. It's one of Beppu's infamous hells, a series of geothermal pools that look beautiful, but are basically open-air death traps. Chinoike, for example, looks like a bubbling red paint, and people are curious enough that someone had to nail down a sign spelling out the obvious. Each one of Beppu's hells has its own twisted theme. One's filled with crocodiles, another spits boiling mud, and all of them exist to prove that Japan can make even geothermal danger look like an art form. The town turned them into a tourist attraction called Jigoku Meguri, which literally means hell tour. You can grab snacks, shop for souvenirs, and even try hell-steamed pudding. Other countries treat their boiling ponds with a little more fear and a lot less marketing. Yellowstone, for example, is covered in warning signs for a reason. The ground looks solid, until it suddenly isn't. People have ignored those warnings and either ended up hospitalized or worse. Dominica's boiling lake is just as deadly, constantly bubbling near 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 93 degrees Celsius. A few unlucky hikers have either collapsed from volcanic gases or slipped in before realizing that nature doesn't give second chances. Instead of sealing off the danger, the town of Beppu built snack stands around it. And now, the warning signs themselves have become part of the spectacle. This might sound extreme, but it's nothing compared to the Tier 5 sign warning people about explosives buried in the ground. White Mountains sign. You're hiking through New Hampshire on a sunny July afternoon. Shorts, sunglasses, maybe a granola bar in your pocket. It feels harmless enough. The trail's calm, the sky's clear, and the summit seems easy. Then, you spot a big wooden sign that reads, Stop. The area ahead has the worst weather in America. Many have died there from exposure, even in the summer. Turn back now if the weather is bad. Nothing says enjoy your hike quite like being warned that you're walking into America's death trap. It might sound like an exaggeration, but Mount Washington has earned that warning. Over 160 people have died on or near its summit since the 1800s. And nearly half of those deaths happen during summer. Warm weather tricks hikers into thinking it's safe, But fleece and good intentions don't get you very far when the mountain decides otherwise. At 6,288 feet, it's not exactly the highest mountain out there, though it still poses quite a challenge. The real problem, though, is its location. Cold air from Canada, warm air off the Atlantic, and continental weather systems all collide right at the ridge. That creates blizzards in June, hurricane winds in October, and July wind chills that can freeze skin in minutes. The Mount Washington Observatory has tracked it since 1932, and even they can't keep their gear working because the weather tears through electronics. In 2013, Shi Chen, a 53-year-old Mount Washington hiker, texted his wife that he was cold, wet, and certain he would die without help. Hours later, rescuers found him unresponsive on the Gulfside Trail. The date was June 18, so locals weren't exactly expecting heavy snowfall, but the winds on the White Mountains were hitting 80 miles an hour, with snow. In another case, William Davis, a 79-year-old tourist from Florida, rode the Cog Railway up the mountain with no map and no plan. His body was later found 400 feet off trail after a fall down a steep slope. And every summer, the same story plays out. People ignore the forecast, hike past the tree line, and end up dialing 911 when the weather turns. Rescuers have to go up in the same storm to get them out. That's why the sign is so blunt. Once you step past it and things go south, it's your funeral, literally. This one sounds cold, sure, but wait until we hit the Tier 5 entry, where officials had to tell people what to do if they stumble across a corpse. Road ends in water. Most road signs exist to state the obvious. They carry instructions like stop, yield, and slippery when wet. But every now and then, you'll run into one that makes you wonder how many people had to screw up before someone decided to put it in writing. The road ends in water sign is one of those. These signs usually show up near boat ramps, river crossings, and causeways. They're there because in the past, cars have literally kept driving until they weren't on a road anymore, just sinking in a lake or river. It sounds like the kind of mistake that'll happen every once in a while, but there are entire news stories built on it. In 2016, for example, a 24-year-old woman accidentally drove straight into the Mississippi River after missing a curve, and rescuers had to pull her body from the water. Florida has seen its share too, with cars ending up in canals because drivers followed GPS instructions a little too faithfully. Even Google Maps had to adjust warnings in certain areas because people were ending up nose deep in water instead of their Airbnb. That's why these signs exist. Somewhere in a planning meeting, someone had to say, okay, that's it. We've had enough people drive into the bayou. Time to get a sign. What really pushes this whole thing into bizarre territory is that in some places, the signs aren't just at the edge of the road. They're planted right in the water to clear up any doubts you might have. If you drive down certain flooded causeways in Louisiana or rural Australia, keep your eyes peeled and you might spot one of these bright yellow warnings poking out of the lake. Tier 2, Sniper at Work sign. Red triangle signs usually warn about cows on the road or rocks falling on your car. But in South Armagh, Northern Ireland during the 1990s, it meant something else entirely. Instead of a construction worker with a shovel, this one showed the silhouette of a hooded man with a rifle and read, Sniper at Work. And no, it wasn't a joke or a local prank. The signs showed up during the South Armagh sniper campaign. But to understand why they existed in the first place, you have to go back a bit. Ireland had been under British rule for centuries, and when it was eventually partitioned in 1921, Northern Ireland stayed under British control. That didn't sit well with everyone. The Irish Republican Army, or IRA, was formed with the goal of ending British rule and uniting Ireland. Decades later, in 1969, the group split, and the Provisional IRA took over as the armed wing of the movement. What followed was a violent, decades-long conflict known as the Troubles. By the 1990s, South Armagh had become one of the Provisional IRA's main strongholds. During that time, they got their hands on Barrett 50 caliber rifles, massive military-grade weapons built to destroy armored vehicles. Against that kind of firepower, British Army flak jackets might as well have been made of cardboard. From 1990 to 1997, sniper teams carried out hit-and-run attacks from barns, fields, and even modified cars turned into mobile sniper nests. The army and media started calling South Armagh Bandit Country, which is military shorthand for, we don't actually control this place. The signs weren't empty threats. Soldiers driving through towns like Crossmaglen and Forkhill knew perfectly well that they were targets. The signs served two purposes. Tactically, they kept everyone on edge. Psychologically, they reminded the army that no matter how many patrols they sent, they were still guests in someone else's territory. The campaign worked better than anyone in London wanted to admit. Between 1990 and 1997, sniper fire killed at least 9 members of the British Army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary and wounded dozens more. Some of the victims were young recruits who'd barely learned how to patrol. Others were police officers caught in routine duties. For the soldiers stationed in South Armagh, morale tanked fast. Convoys started skipping vehicle checks, and patrols shortened their routes because standing still too long felt like volunteering to die. After the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, the gunfire stopped, but the signs stayed up long enough for locals to reclaim them in their own way. Graffiti artists changed them to things like sniper on hold or job seeking. Well, that's one way to prove the war didn't rob the locals of their sense of humor. Percy Priest Lake. Percy Priest Lake sits just outside Nashville, and it looks like the perfect spot for a picnic or a lazy day on the water. It was built in the 60s after the Army Corps of Engineers dammed the Stones River, and now it's where people go to swim, fish, or drift around, acting like they know how to drive a boat. It all feels pretty normal until you notice the sign by the shore that lists exactly how many people have drowned there. The sign isn't there for decoration. It's there because Percy Priest is dangerous in ways that catch people off guard. The bottom drops off quicker than most swimmers expect, and the water gets murky fast. Cliff jumpers misjudge the height, boaters get caught in the current, and even strong swimmers can vanish in minutes. By the time rescue crews arrive, it's usually a recovery, not a rescue. Local officials eventually started keeping a public tally, since the drownings just kept happening. They happened so often that families showing up for summer outings were met with fresh numbers year after year. Looking at the sign, it's easy to see numbers and move on, but those numbers are real people. In 2019, one of them was an 8-year-old girl who drowned during a family trip. This year, 2 more were added just days apart. One was a 5-year-old child who was out swimming with family, and the other, a 27-year-old man near the dam. Another thing people don't think about is that every time there's a drowning, a worker, probably from the Corps, shows up with a ladder to change the sign. It's about as depressing a job as you can get, but it does the trick. People stop, stare, and think twice before diving in. Of course, some don't, which is exactly why the count keeps going up. Do not ski alone. You're skiing in Vermont, enjoying the quiet woods when you see a sign that ruins the mood. It says, "Do not ski alone." But that's not all. There's a little drawing of a skier under a tree with the caption, "These woods will be as cold and lonely tonight as they were 200 years ago." Nothing like a reminder of your own mortality to spice up a winter holiday. The thing is, the sign isn't exaggerating. People really do vanish in the trees. The culprit is something called a tree well, which is just an air pocket that forms around the base of a tree. If you slide in head first, you'll end up stuck upside down with your skis pointing at the sky. 9 times out of 10, you can't get out by yourself. That means your survival depends on whether anyone's around to notice before the snow quietly finishes the job. Ski patrols are full of these cases. In British Columbia back in 2022, a 60-year-old skier went off trail, hit a cliff, and landed in deep powder. The patrol reached him in minutes, and still, it wasn't fast enough. Across US resorts, the number averages around 40 deaths a year, usually from accidents that sound simple until you realize how fast they turn final. That's why buddy rules exist. It's not really about company. Sure, it's nice to have someone to complain to, chat with, but mostly it's about someone actually noticing when you vanish. Even a few minutes without eyes on you, and your chances of getting pulled out alive drop to near zero. Think of it as a lifeguard policy. If things go south, you'll have someone there to call for help, assuming they don't panic and freeze up. Stop. Prevent your death. Florida has plenty of signs that try to keep you alive. Don't feed the gators, don't swim here, don't stand under that coconut tree, you get the idea. But the sign at Eagle's Nest Sinkhole really turns things up a notch. It says, "Stop. Prevent your death. There's nothing in this cave worth dying for." When the authorities realized words alone weren't enough to convince people not to drown, they added a Grim Reaper illustration to really drive home the message. To the untrained eye, Eagle's Nest looks like any other swampy pond tucked away in a wildlife reserve. But underneath, it drops into a mile of flooded caves that sink 300 feet into Florida's limestone. Drivers like to call it the Mount Everest of cave dives, which is one way of saying it's beautiful, hard to survive, and attracts people who really want to test their luck. In 2016, 3 friends gave it a shot. Patrick Peacock and Chris Rittenmeyer were experienced cave explorers. Their friend, Justin Blakely, wasn't, so he stayed closer to the surface while the others went deeper. They planned to meet back at 3 in the afternoon. Justin came up on time, but his friends didn't. He waited until nightfall before calling for help. The next day, Rescue divers found Peacock and Rittenmeyer at 260 feet in one of the cave's deadlier sections. Sadly, this wasn't even the first tragedy. On Christmas Day in 2013, a man named Darren Spivey and his 15-year-old son, Dylan Sanchez, went diving there. Darren had some experience, but Dylan had none. They descended into a chamber called the Ballroom, dropped past 200 feet, and both ran out of air before they could reach the surface. Dylan's body was recovered at 67 feet. His father was found at 127. To this day, people still argue about what caused the deaths. Some blame equipment failure. Others say nitrogen narcosis. That little trick your brain plays where you feel fine while quietly drowning. But honestly, it doesn't matter. There really is nothing down there worth dying for. Unless you count being another cautionary tale as some sort of prize. This one's pretty blunt, but in Tier 4, there's a sign taped to a restaurant door that basically tells employees to prepare for the worst. Deadly manure gases. On a farm, you know to look out for things like tractors, freakishly powerful farm animals, and of course, sharp objects for obvious reasons. What's less obvious is the manure pit. It looks boring enough, but the air above it can kill you faster than falling in will. That's why in some farms, you'll find a sign that reads, "Danger, deadly manure gases. Possible death may be immediate. Do not enter pit without safety equipment." Manure pits aren't just waste storage. As the muck breaks down without oxygen, it brews gases like hydrogen sulfide, methane, carbon dioxide, and ammonia. Each one is bad news, but hydrogen sulfide is the star of the show. At low levels, it smells like rotten eggs, so at least you know it's there. At higher levels, it knocks out your sense of smell, which is the gas equivalent of turning off the smoke alarm before the fire. At around 100 parts per million, it burns your eyes and lungs. At 800 parts per million, it paralyzes your breathing. At 1000 ppm, one breath is enough to knock you out, and maybe even kill you. Carbon dioxide is just as sneaky. It pushes oxygen out of the air, leaving you to suffocate in what feels like perfectly normal air. Methane, on the other hand, is more dramatic. Between 5% and 15% of air volume, it's explosive. One spark from a motor or a cigarette someone shouldn't have been smoking in a barn anyway, and the whole place turns into a crater. Ammonia is the least lethal, but it will still chew up your lungs if you give it enough time. All of these gases sit together in manure pits, waiting for whoever climbs in next. And because you can't see or smell the danger, deaths keep happening. In July 1989, 5 members of a Pennsylvania farm family died in sequence. One climbed into the pit to fix equipment and collapsed. The rest rushed in after him, each one following the last, until 3 generations were gone. None of them lasted long enough to drag the others back out. The coroner said the cause of death was oxygen deficiency, and the official advice that followed was for farmers to treat every pit like a confined space. Ventilate before entry, and never go in without a detector. But farms don't work like that. Families see pits as part of chores, not as industrial hazards. So even though OSHA puts out alerts, courses get written, and warning signs go up, people still die the same way. Tier 3. Beware stinging tree sign. In most parks, the warning signs tell you to watch out for snakes or maybe spiders. But in Queensland's rainforest, the signs warn you about the trees. They read, "Beware stinging tree," which sounds silly until you learn what the tree in question actually does. The Gimpy plant, better known as the stinging tree, is covered in tiny needle-like hairs. Each one is a hypodermic needle full of venom. Brush against it and the hairs lodge in your skin, pumping in a neurotoxin your body can't switch off. Victims describe it as being set on fire and electrocuted at the same time. And the pain doesn't go away. It can last for weeks, even months, and it sometimes flares up years later when the skin touches cold air or water. That's what happened to Naomi Lewis, a mother of 4 from Cairns. After she came in contact with the tree while mountain biking, she said it was worse than childbirth. The sting was so bad she started vomiting. Her husband tried to wax the hairs out of her skin in the car park while they waited for an ambulance, but that still didn't help. At the hospital, all doctors could do was hand out pain relief and pile on hot blankets. She lived on painkillers and warm compresses for months, and 9 months later, she still felt stings like snapping rubber bands on her leg. If that freaked you out, good, because cases like this happen more often than you'd like to think. A hospital study in Cairns logged nearly 50 cases in just 3 years. Of course, most of the victims were tourists who somehow thought the signs were just decoration. The locals have had centuries to perfect the art of self-preservation, so they know better. Early colonial reports say horses dropped dead just from brushing against it. and soldiers supposedly went mad from the pain. One story from the 1940s tells of a man who used a leaf as toilet paper and ended up shooting himself because the pain was unbearable. You can't exactly run a fact check on this, but once you know the tree's reputation, it all makes sense. Lava Falls sign. At Lava Beds National Monument, there's a fire danger sign near Lava Falls that's lived through a wildfire of its own. When the Caldwell fire ripped through in 2020, the sign burned on just one side. The other side remained just fine while everything behind it was torched. The fire started with a single lightning strike on July 21st. Within days, it ballooned across 80,000 acres and leveled more than 70% of the park. Lava Beds is called the land of burnt-out fires because of its volcanic past. But this wasn't the slow burn of lava fields. Rangers said flames moved so fast they skipped around at random. One plant would be torched, then the next one over would be perfectly fine. Wildland firefighters were called in to contain the situation, but the wind kept shifting. And before they knew it, the fire was suddenly coming from behind them. Even the most experienced crew members who were used to dealing with wildland blazes said they'd never seen behavior like this in the area before. When the fire eventually died down, homes had been evacuated, thousands of dead trees cut down, and much of the park turned into ash. Visitors were kept out until rangers could make sure the caves weren't filled with smoke, and the roads weren't lined with falling timber. Through all of that, the fire danger sign stayed put. Extreme danger. Submerged Weir sign. Weirs are one of those things most people never notice. They're little dams built into rivers to control water levels, but from upstream, they just look like part of the river. The water runs smooth until it drops. Then, the current folds back on itself, and suddenly you're stuck in what engineers with no sense of optimism like to call the drowning machine. Because of the danger, the signs on weirs are pretty blunt. They say things like extreme danger, submerged weir, the drowning machine. If you go over, the current drags you back to the dam again and again. It knocks the air out of you, drags down even strong swimmers, and makes life jackets about a third less useful. The best advice experts have is to curl into a ball, sink to the bottom, and hope the current spits you out further downstream. It's hardly a plan, but it's all that exists. There are thousands of these dams across the US, most built a century ago to run mills or control floods. On average, they kill around 50 people every year. The deaths are so routine that state agencies issue reminders like they're talking about deer season. In May 2022, Jonathan Gentle, an experienced kayaker, went over a low-head dam on the Delaware River. His father watched as the current kept him trapped until it was too late. A few weeks later, 23-year-old Lauren Winstead was pulled under Bosher Dam in Virginia during a Memorial Day float trip. Her body turned up 5 miles downstream. When people actually started poking around, it turned out that neither site had a single clear warning up. And that's why, disturbing as the warning signs may be, they're actually pretty important. Do you know where the bears are? Imagine walking up to a gate that leads into a polar bear enclosure, and the first thing you see is a sign that asks, "Do you know where the bears are?" Right next to it, there's another one that says, "Have you checked all gates, races, and locks before you leave?" As creepy as it sounds, that's just the zoo's way of reminding keepers that if they can't answer that question, they probably shouldn't step inside the cage. The bears live in connected dens and tunnels, so the questions are practical. Are the bears locked up, or are they waiting for you in the hallway? The truth is, as much as people like to think of polar bears as real-life plush toys, they're actually the largest land carnivores alive, with males tipping the scale at over half a ton. Even the younger ones can break bones without much effort. Zookeepers know this, which is why the sign exists. In the zoo, knowing where the bears are is enough, because there's a fence, a zookeeper, and security personnel who'll intervene if things go south. Out in the wild, it's an entirely different ballgame. Spotting the bears is only the beginning. What you do after is what determines whether you'll make it out of the encounter alive or not. In July 2024, a man named Omar Farang Zin was riding through Romania's Carpathian Mountains, home to one of Europe's biggest bear populations. He saw a cub, parked his motorcycle next to a warning sign that specifically told him not to approach, and decided it was a good time for a photo. The mama bear disagreed. She mauled him, dragged him 260 feet down a ravine, and left him dead at the bottom. Authorities later tracked down the mother bear and killed her, which is a standard procedure in Romania after a fatal attack. That sparked the usual debate. Are there too many bears? Or just too many people who think warning signs are just cute little post-it notes? Romania has somewhere between 10,000 and 13,000 brown bears, the biggest population in Europe outside Russia, and has seen close to 30 recorded deaths in the last 20 years. Parliament's solution was to double the cull quota, which critics say is unfair because it punishes wildlife for behaving, well, like wildlife. Tier 4. Evacuate the island if you hear 8 short blasts. Some signs need context. This one doesn't. It means exactly what it says. If the siren goes off 8 times, you don't stick around to finish your meal or pack a bag. You leave immediately. Sirens exist because someone already calculated how fast water, fire, or an industrial accident can wipe out a town, and then decided that everyone deserves a head start. The only way you make it out alive is to treat the sound like a countdown clock, because in most cases, it is. Take the Texas Hill Country, better known as Flash Flood Alley, for example. The town of Comfort has sirens that can wake up the whole community when the Guadalupe River starts to rise. Right next door is Kerr County. Officials decided sirens weren't worth the cost. In July 2025, Comfort's system went off and people evacuated in time. In Kerr County, the water rose 26 feet in less than an hour. More than 100 people drowned, including dozens of kids at a summer camp who had no phones and didn't get any warning. The decision came down to money. A county-wide siren system cost about $1 million, and that was deemed too extravagant. They relied on phone alerts instead. As if cell service in rural Texas works when you need it. Or as if sleeping people read text messages in the middle of the night. Sirens don't need cell towers, and they don't care if your ringer is off. They cut through storms, sleep, and denial, which is why they're perfect for the job. They aren't foolproof, but they're their best bet. The aftermath of the flooding was exactly what you'd expect. People dug through the wreckage hoping to find their loved ones. Deputies found clothes and toys buried in the mud, and search teams pulled out bodies out of trees. Comfort lost no one, but sadly, Kerr County lost entire families. That's why wherever it shows up, the sign doesn't bother with details. 8 short blasts means get out right now, not later. Secret nuclear bunker sign. Nothing says top secret quite like a big brown tourist sign with an arrow pointing you toward the secret nuclear bunker. And yes, that's exactly what you'll find in Essex, guiding traffic right through Kelvedon and Hatch, one of Britain's most important Cold War facilities. Apparently, keeping it discreet was less important than making sure no visitor got lost on the way in. The bunker itself was built in the early 1950s, when Britain was still trying to guess what nuclear war would look like. The government seized farmland and dug a 3-story complex 125 feet underground. They said it was an air defense station, but in reality, it was a regional seat of government, which is the official way of saying that when the bombs fell, politicians and military staff had a place to hide, while everyone else would have to make do with being radioactive. It was stocked for survival too. Filtered air, water supply, diesel generators, communications gear hardened against EMPs. Everything you'd need if you were one of the lucky few allowed through the door. On the outside though, it didn't look like much. Just a little farmhouse in the woods with a front door that led to a tunnel. The camouflage was good, but of course, a hidden location won't stay hidden forever when you slap signage on the highway. By the 1990s, the Cold War was over. The bunker was decommissioned, and the land was sold back to the same family it was taken from. They opened it to tourists, which is one of the few times in history the government's secrets turned into someone else's cash flow. Today, busloads of school kids and curious families filed past racks of Geiger counters and old teleprinters to see what was once the government's panic room. Essex even put up official road signs so no one misses it. The secret nuclear bunker is now so well advertised that Top Gear filmed a segment there. Today, the sign is a reminder that while the government once planned for mass death, their top priority was always making sure they had somewhere comfortable to ride it out. Welcome to Accident. Accident, Maryland looks like any other quiet little American town until you drive past the sign that says, Welcome to Accident. With only a few hundred people living there, it feels less like a greeting and more like a warning label. You see it, instinctively slow down and start wondering what exactly went wrong here. The name came from a mistake that never got fixed. Back in 1751, King George II paid off a debt by handing George Deacon 600 acres of land in western Maryland. Deacon sent out 2 survey teams who didn't know about each other, and both ended up mapping the same plot of land starting from the same oak tree. Instead of calling it what it was, sloppy, Deacons labeled it the Accident Track. The name stuck, and when the place officially became a town in 1916, it was incorporated as Accident. The people living there are called accidentals, and I'm sure they all let out a collective sigh every time they had to say it out loud. After the Revolutionary War, veterans were paid in land around Accident. Most sold it off immediately because retiring in the middle of nowhere under a banner that literally says Accident didn't feel like much of a reward. The word accident usually points to mistakes, bad luck, or things people want to move past. In Maryland, it's printed neatly on a roadside sign. The locals might shrug it off, maybe even embrace it. But for everyone else, the unease starts the second they cross that line. Danger. Never open this door after dark. Every restaurant has that one back door nobody likes. It opens onto a dark alley, creaks, and at night, it feels more like bait than an exit. That's usually where you'll see signs like this one that says, Danger. Never open this door after dark. Always look before you open this door. Your life could depend on it. It sounds dramatic, but the reason is simple. Restaurants that stay open late handle cash, and once the rush dies down, the back door is the weakest spot in the building. If there was a robber around, they wouldn't need to come up with some grand plan to get into the building. All they'd have to do is wait for somebody to crack the door open for a smoke break or answer a knock without checking. That's why owners and insurers push the rule that back doors should be kept closed. And if you do open it, make sure you know who's outside. The wording might seem over the top, but the numbers back it up. The FBI lists restaurants right alongside gas stations and convenience stores as common targets for violent crime. Add in late-night cash drops, skeleton crews, and employees heading home alone in the dark, and you've got a recipe for trouble. That's why the sign says your life could depend on it. There have been plenty of cases where closing staff were dragged back inside, tied up, or worse. All because somebody thought nothing bad could come from cracking a door open. Even theft from employees adds to the mess, which is why rules about deposits, safes, and keys exist in the first place. The most disturbing part about this sign isn't the wording. It's that a business had to make the rule in the first place. Holy water has been temporarily removed. If you've ever been inside a Catholic church, you've probably seen the little fonts of holy water by the entrance. You dip your fingers, make the sign of the cross, and walk in. It's muscle memory for most people. That's why the paper sign that showed up in 2020 stopped people in their tracks. They read, Holy water has been temporarily removed. At first glance, it almost sounds like a supply issue. Looks like someone forgot to reorder a shipment. But this was peak COVID, when touching any public surface suddenly felt like licking a subway pole. Dipping your hand into communal water was basically a free sample of whatever the last 10 people before you were carrying. So dioceses, the church districts in charge across the world, ordered fonts to be drained. The signs went up in US, Europe, Africa, pretty much everywhere Catholic parishes were open at the time. It wasn't just about the water either. Communion chalices were pulled, handshakes during the Peace Be With You were cut, and the fonts stayed bone dry for months. For a lot of Catholics, it was jarring. Holy water is tied to blessing, protection, and baptism. So walking in and finding a paper sign over an empty font felt like something essential had been stripped away. People reacted in different ways. Some just shrugged and got used to blessing themselves with sanitizer instead. Others weren't as calm. Priests reported spikes in requests for blessings and exorcisms, because without holy water in the fonts, some parishioners felt spiritually unprotected. A few even admitted to sneaking holy water home before the fonts were drained, just in case. The signs themselves became internet gold. Photos spread around with people joking that not even holy water could save the world now. It was funny in a bleak way because it reminded people that the world had gotten so dangerous that even holy water had to be treated like a biohazard. Tier 5. Danger, Minefield sign. Danger, Minefield is one of those signs nobody argues with. White letters on red metal, maybe a skull tossed in for emphasis, and that's all it needs. The message is as straightforward as it gets. Step forward and the ground might blow you apart. In Cambodia, these signs are everywhere. They're stuck into rice fields, forests, and sometimes right outside schools, because the soil is still full of explosives left from wars that ended before most of the population was born. Mines don't retire when soldiers go home. They also don't care that peace treaties were signed and everyone's moved on. They just sit in the dirt waiting for whoever happens to walk by. Two professional D-miners, Pav Nepin and Owen Chinara, learned that the hard way in Otter Manchi province when an anti-tank mine detonated as they cleared farmland. The men weren't careless, and they certainly weren't untrained, but the mine had been there longer than they'd been alive, and they didn't stand a chance. Cambodia has been trying to fix this problem for over 30 years. They destroyed more than 1 million anti-personnel mines and millions of other explosives. And yet, 1,600 square kilometers of ground remain contaminated. More than 1 million people live with that reality every day. They just try to be as careful as possible. Don't farm here, don't build here, maybe don't even walk here just to be safe. And still, accidents happen. Since 1979, more than 20,000 people have been killed by mines in Cambodia, and twice as many have been injured. And this isn't just Cambodia's problem. In Ukraine, swimmers at Black Sea beaches have also been killed by drifting mines laid during the ongoing war. Most of the victims were vacationers who thought the water looked fine and knew nothing about the explosives. Officials later explained that hundreds of mines have been dumped into the sea. Some were intentionally placed to block shipping routes, while others tore loose in storms. But once they hit the coast, the effect was the same. The beach turned into a live fire zone. You don't know who is lurking here. You're walking home in Hastings and decide to take a shortcut through the trees. It's quiet, the path is narrow, and then you see a sign that says, "You don't know who is lurking here. Enter at your own risk." It's the kind of warning you'd expect to see outside a haunted house, not on your way back from the shop. But this one is real, and it's there because it's the council's way of letting you know they can't guarantee you won't get jumped on the way. The path runs from Sandrock Park to St. Helens Church, and it's had a bad reputation for years. Too many bushes, no lighting, and not enough people around to help if something went wrong. Police had logged incidents before, but in January 2015, things escalated. A 14-year-old girl was grabbed by a man who tried to drag her into the trees. He got as far as putting his hand up her skirt before she screamed and ran. She escaped, but investigators quickly noticed the assault mirrored another attack that had happened in the same place a year earlier. That was the breaking point. The council, schools, probation workers, and police all rushed to fix the path. They cleared vegetation, put up fencing, installed CCTV, and then held a student competition to design warning signs. You have to agree, nothing says we take this seriously quite like recruiting a bunch of kids to treat it as an art project. When the contest was over, the winning designs went up. Officials gave speeches, and everyone declared the problem solved. Except it wasn't. The language on the sign had created a new problem of its own. It was meant to reassure pedestrians, maybe even scare off attackers. But what it really does is make sure nobody wants to use the path at all. You can't read it without picturing the exact scenario it's describing. Someone in the bushes, watching, waiting. It's an accidental confession that the place has been unsafe for years and only got attention once kids were assaulted. If you discover a dead body. Yes, that's really how the sign starts. It then goes to say, do not attempt to give medical assistance. Do not approach within 5 meters. Report the incident immediately. When you first come across this one, it sounds like something you'd find outside a quarantine zone. But in reality, it's not from a health department or police agency at all. It was set dressing from David J. Rogers' book series, Yellow Dawn, where survivors of a deadly disaster live under the thumb of a fictional agency called UTOC. The sign was designed to unsettle readers, and it worked so well that when a copy popped up in England years later, people thought it was official. Someone posted it online, it spread, and suddenly, thousands of people were Googling the book. And honestly, it's no wonder it fooled people. Warnings about how to handle corpses don't sound far-fetched. Sometimes real officials print them. Death in public is awkward, and the law doesn't always handle it consistently. In most of the US, for example, finding a dead body doesn't legally obligate you to do much. Oregon once made headlines when a woman lived with her sister's corpse for months and never reported it. Morally, it horrified people, but legally, it wasn't a crime. Michigan only passed a law in 2011 that requires bodies to be reported after a woman's overdose went unreported for days. Vermont went in the opposite direction and made it punishable to ignore someone in trouble, meaning you can actually be fined for walking away in someone's time of need. So, you see, the legal system hasn't quite decided if ignoring a corpse makes you negligent, criminal, or just unlucky. That's what makes Rogers' fictional sign hit so close to home. Real dispatchers really do give blunt instructions. It's not unusual to hear them say things like, don't move the body, or don't start CPR when it's obviously too late, or even don't trample a possible crime scene. Operators repeat these same lines to hikers, joggers, and neighbors who dial 911 after walking into someone else's final moment. The message is always the same. Stay calm, stay back, and wait for professionals. So no, the dead body sign never belonged to a real outbreak, but it works because it plays on something universal. Death can show up in public without warning, and when it does, people want someone in authority to tell them what to do next. Emergency medical staff has been infected. Hospital signs usually tell you boring things like don't use your phone, wear a mask, or wait your turn. But during the coronavirus outbreak in Beijing, one hospital put up a notice that no one could have seen coming. It said, emergency medical staff has been infected. We will no longer treat patients. Quarantine underway. Nothing like walking into the ER and finding out the ER is closed because the doctors are patients now. So how does a hospital get to that point? Simple. The staff caught what the patients had. When the Omicron variant of COVID-19 spread in late 2021, officials kept saying it was less severe than Delta. Technically true, but there were complications. It spread faster, killed fewer people. But that didn't matter to doctors and nurses running 12-hour shifts in overcrowded wards. They were getting sick in waves. A survey across hospitals in Beijing and Hebei made it clear. 93 doctors and 227 nurses were tracked, and almost all of them reported symptoms: fever, cough, fatigue, sore throat, loss of taste and smell. Female nurses reported longer bouts of coughing and fatigue. Male nurses had more fever and stomach issues. But in the grand scheme, it all boiled down to one thing: the staff were too sick to treat anyone else. That's why the sign is disturbing. Hospitals are supposed to be the last line of defense. Even if everything else collapses, you expect the ER to still be running. A door notice admitting "we can't help you" cuts right through that illusion. The system failed because the people holding it up had been so overwhelmed that despite their best efforts, they fell over. Other countries shut things down too. Churches in Italy closed. Lourdes in France drained its pools, and Miami locked its beaches. But all of that pales in comparison to a hospital slapping quarantine tape on its own doors. That's a disturbing signs iceberg. If nothing else, it proves humans are very good at two things: identifying hazards and stapling metal plates to warn each other after the fact. Either way, the warnings are there. What you do with them is up to you. That's all for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe.